Welcome to the training program, Just-in-Time Board Orientation. My name is Frank Martinelli. I'm the presenter of today's training program. I'm the president of the Center for Public Skills Training. Well, let's get into it. Just-in-Time Board Orientation. It's intended to be a board training resource that you and your nonprofit can depend upon in the future. The Just-in-Time Board Orientation program is designed to provide a clear, crisp picture of board members' responsibilities in critical areas. We believe it will increase board member confidence and productivity in board and committee meetings right from the start. Just-in-Time Board Orientation is designed especially for new board members. It will also be helpful to members who have been on the board for a while. This topic is especially important today. The ability of a nonprofit organization to carry out its mission and vision depends on the strength of its organizational foundation. A critical element of this foundation is the board of directors itself. The board carries the mission of the nonprofit into the community and brings the views of the community into the nonprofit. The importance of the board to the effectiveness and mission impact of the nonprofit cannot be overstated. As we get started, please have the board orientation resource packet available to you. It has been sent along with this training program video. We'll be referring to it from time to time. Let me remind you that this training program can be viewed again and again to refresh you on the material presented. Here's what we're going to cover. We'll start by looking at the collective and individual responsibilities of board members, including the 3 legal standards that board members must adhere to. Then we'll take a look at some of the important ways that board members do their work together. I want to make something clear from the very beginning. The focus of Just-in-Time Board Orientation is on a specific kind of board, the governing board of a nonprofit organization with tax-exempt status, referred to as a 501c3 organization. This is the legal board of directors of your nonprofit. While some of the information will certainly apply to other kinds of boards, advisory boards, for example, our focus is on the governing board of a nonprofit. Board effectiveness and the performance of individual board members continues to be a top concern among nonprofits. According to a recent survey of regional and national studies concerning the challenges of nonprofits, building an active and strategically oriented board of directors was the most frequently cited concern. This graphic of a rear view mirror of a car is a reminder that the board, while it does have a responsibility to, in a sense, look backwards, what's happened since the last board meeting, what's happened in the last quarter, what's happened year to date, is an important function and responsibility of the board. But the message in Just-in-Time Board Orientation is that even though it is important to spend some of our time, in a sense, looking backwards, looking in the rearview mirror, that as a board, we want to look for ways of spending more and more of our time together, looking up and out at the future, the horizon, looking through the windshield, if you will, instead of the rear view mirror. Before we examine the board at work, I want to make mention of several big issues related to governance that board members are increasingly grappling with. And as a member of your board, you can expect to be dealing with these issues as well. First, increasingly, nonprofits are exploring new forms of working together. Boards need to understand what's at stake so that they can provide higher level guidance with respect to alliances, partnerships, and collaboration opportunities. Second, in the nonprofit world, there is increased attention to succession planning for both the board and the staff. Third, achieving long-term financial sustainability is a critical issue for most nonprofits today. This has always been important, and in the last several years, it has been even more at the forefront of board deliberation and decision-making. Fourth, the importance of being able to measure our mission impact in concrete ways. Our funders are requiring it, and as board leaders, it's something that we need to pay special attention to. And finally, the role of your nonprofit in advocacy and public policy work. For many nonprofits who up to this point have been focused primarily on the provision of programs and services, the importance of thinking about nonprofit advocacy as another way that we can really advance our mission in the community becomes another important issue. I'd like to start with the basics. First, to be an effective board member, you'll need access to a number of key resources. Typically, these materials are included in a manual given to board members at the beginning of their service. Such a board manual includes some of the materials that are listed here: various legal documents, information about the programs and services of the organization, financial information, the strategic plan, information about board and staff members, the committee structure, and much, much more. If you haven't received these materials yet, be sure to request them from your executive director or your board president. This program is built on a few key assumptions about board governance. First, we make a clear distinction between the governing roles and responsibilities of the board of directors on the one hand, and the management responsibilities of the executive director. The English word govern comes from a Greek word meaning to steer the ship. And that's exactly what boards focus on when they make higher level governance decisions that keep the nonprofit on course. Another way to think about this is the distinction made between ends and means decision making. John and Miriam Carver, who are well known in the field, speak in terms of the ends decision making responsibilities of the board. These are decisions that cover things like our purpose or mission, who is our customer, the beneficiary of our programs and services, and what results will we hold ourselves accountable for delivering and at what cost. The means decision-making is the responsibility of our professional staff. It's their job to implement the ends decision-making of the board of directors. Another important assumption, effective board governance is built on clarity and agreement about who does what is the board responsible for, and what is the paid professional staff responsible for. And then finally, the notion that the board speaks with one voice or not at all. This is another bit of guidance from the Carvers. The message here is that the board is able to exercise its governance responsibility only when it is meeting as the board in a board meeting called in compliance with any requirements set forth in the bylaws. So individually, as board members, we don't govern. It's only together, collectively. To get into a discussion of board roles and responsibilities, I'd want to draw from two important models of governance. You'll find links to more information about these governance models in the resource bibliography in your board resource manual. First, I'd like to talk about the dynamic board model developed by McKinsey & Company. Let's take a look. This model posits three key roles, and you can see them as the three sides of the triangle. And for each of these roles, a number of detailed responsibilities are enumerated. Let's start with the first, shaping the mission and strategic direction of the organization, the upper left side of the triangle. And some of the specific responsibilities under this first major role, shaping the mission and the vision, and then engaging in an ongoing way in terms of actively making decisions that pertain to strategy, future direction, and then the other policy decisions that are required by this. And I think the message in this model, in the discussion of this first role, is that the board needs to be engaged in strategic thinking and planning and decision making on an ongoing basis. The second overarching role, over on the right side of the triangle, ensuring leadership and resources, and some of the subpoints or detailed responsibilities include selecting, evaluating, and developing our executive director or CEO, making sure that the organization has the resources needed to deliver on the mission. As board members, we also have a responsibility to provide expertise and any access to other sources of expertise so that the organization can meet internal needs. And then finally, enhancing the reputation of the organization, sometimes referred to as the community ambassador role of board members. And then the third overarching responsibility, monitoring and improving performance. Again, a number of subpoints or responsibilities. The board is responsible for attending to, overseeing the financial condition of the organization and making sure that appropriate risk management procedures and policies and systems are in place. It's also the board's responsibility to monitor the performance and the effectiveness of the programs and services offered by the organization, and ensuring the accountability of the paid professional staff. And then also, the board has a responsibility to consider its own performance and to take steps to continually enhance the effectiveness of the board individually and collectively. The second governance model comes from the book Governance as Leadership by Richard Chait, William Ryan, and Barbara Taylor. And the model goes by the same name as the book, The Governance as Leadership Framework. Let's take a look. The authors posit three modes or three ways that the board governs. The first mode is called the fiduciary mode. And in this mode, the board is posing a number of questions and expecting answers. How are we doing to date in the last quarter, since the last board meeting, year to date? Are we in compliance with applicable laws and regulations, contracts, agreements? And in general, the board is wanting to make sure that everything is in place. Is there anything wrong? And when the board is operating in this mode, the phrase that the authors sometimes use to capture the fiduciary mode is the board as sentinel or watchdog. Fiduciary mode is important, but it's not enough. The authors insist that in addition to the fiduciary mode, the board needs to operate from a strategic mode. And the word strategic is probably the hint or the clue. Strategic as in strategic thinking and planning. What should the board what should the organization be doing? Where are we going? What is our strategic direction as a nonprofit? And what is the plan? As in, what is the strategic plan? What's the plan for the next 2, 3, 4 years? And in describing the board operating in the strategic mode, the authors use the word strategist. So the board is operating as strategist in partnership with key staff. Strategic mode is important in addition to the fiduciary mode, but even the strategic mode is not enough. The third mode, and this is where this model really takes us to a place that many other governance frameworks don't. The third mode is called the generative mode. And the key questions: what are the new possibilities for our nonprofit? What's coming next for us? And what are the new questions? What are the new problems that we need to address? When the board is operating in this mode, the authors capture the board in this generative mode with the words sense maker. The board is trying to make sense out of what's coming next. And in my own efforts to understand what is the generative mode and how exactly is it different from the strategic mode, I think of the words of Wayne Gretzky, the hockey great, some of you may be familiar with. He was once asked, "What makes you such a great hockey player?" And his answer was very simple and straightforward. "I'm really good at knowing where the puck is going to be next." And that's really what generative mode is about for our nonprofit, for our community, for the people that we're presuming to serve. Where is the puck going to be next? Anyone that knows anything about hockey, and you don't have to be a hockey fanatic to realize this, a puck travels at an incredibly fast speed. So to be able to tell where the puck is going to be next is no small feat. It's a critical skill. Another way of thinking about generative mode, the image or the thought of what is around the bend for our nonprofit. Anything around the bend, well, for one thing, we know that it's probably going to arrive sooner than we think. And secondly, because it's around the bend, we can't see it. We can't see it clearly. And so when the authors talk about the board in the generative mode as the sense makers, making sense out of what's around the bend, out of what's coming next. It's a critical responsibility for the nonprofit board. In trying to make this three modes approach a little bit more concrete, I'd like to talk about the three modes in relation to the annual audit, something that the board is responsible for overseeing, the annual financial audit. So in the fiduciary mode, the board might be looking at the annual audit, and the fiduciary mode question might simply be, did we pass? Did we get a clean audit? What can we learn from this year's audit? In the strategic mode, looking at the same audit, the same information, the same numbers, we might notice something below the surface. The question might be, does the audit pinpoint any issues that are strategic in nature? These are not quick fixable issues. It's not a matter of tweaking the accounting software or perhaps altering the format of the financial reports that the board receives. It's something deeper, and it's going to require more time to figure out. And then looking at that very same audit in the generative mode, the question might be even deeper, even more at the root causes, if you will. Does the audit hint at any emerging developments that could significantly challenge our enterprise or business model or financial condition long term? And so in the generative mode, you might hear board leaders saying things like, You know, I haven't been able to put my finger on it, but for the last couple of years, I've sensed that there is something changing, that our current revenue model is not going to be sufficient, that it's not going to be sustainable in the future. And so that kind of a generative mode question would lead us to some deeper thinking about what we need to do in the future. Here's a chart that tries to summarize the three modes of governance. And we've already talked about the board's role as steward in the fiduciary, strategist in the strategic mode, and sense makers in the generative mode. And the key questions are also different. What's wrong in the fiduciary mode? What's the plan for the next couple of years in the strategic mode? And in the generative mode, what's the question? You'll find more information about the three modes of governance in the resource bibliography in your manual. Let's move on. Let's talk about the collective responsibilities of the board of directors. And here are those three key roles of the board as described in the dynamic board model from McKinsey. We looked at it a moment ago. Let's take each of these three roles one at a time. The first, the board's role in setting the strategic direction, the board as the cheerleader for the mission and the vision of the organization, a responsibility to establish and to live organizational values, to participate in regular strategic planning, to set a strategic vision for the future, major goals and strategies, and then periodically reviewing the annual, more detailed plans of action. And this particular role is closely related to the strategic mode in the governance as leadership model. The second board role, monitoring and improving performance. Some of the responsibilities that we've already touched on, overseeing the financial condition of the organization, making sure that we're managing any risks that we are exposed to given our mission, making sure that we're making reasonable progress on the implementation of our strategic plan, making sure that our programs are having the desired impact, providing legal and moral oversight. We'll talk more about this in just a moment. Evaluating our chief staff officer, our CEO or executive director, usually on an annual basis, and then periodically evaluating our own performance as the board of directors. And thirdly, ensuring leadership and resources, and some of the typical responsibilities, hiring and supporting our chief staff leader, our executive director or CEO, making sure that we have within the board the kind of leadership that the board needs, making sure that there is a fund development plan, that there is a plan for generating the resources that are needed to deliver on our mission, and within that, knowing what our responsibility as board members are, ensuring adequate financial resources in general, and then that community ambassador role that we talked about, building and promoting and communicating a positive image of the organization in the community. So these are some of the collective responsibilities of the board as described in the McKinsey dynamic board model. Now let's take a look at some of the individual responsibilities of board members. And before we even begin, I might mention that an important tool for communicating these individual responsibilities is the board member job description. There's a sample in your resource manual. I encourage you to take a look. In general, we're looking for individual board members to meet the following expectations: to participate actively in the governance of the organization, to attend regular board meetings, to serve as an active committee or work group or task force member, to support the fundraising activities of the organization in a manner that is appropriate for each of us, and we'll talk more about fundraising in just a moment, to do our homework, to prepare before board meetings so that we're ready to set policy and make decisions, to play that community ambassador role in the community. And then increasingly, boards are also expected, in addition to attendance at the regular board meetings, to participate in annual board planning and education events. Let's take a closer look at fundraising. In particular, when we think about the roles of boards today, the expectation for most boards is that they will play a role in generating the resources that are needed to deliver on the mission. And so some of those individual responsibilities, first of all, to know your role in the fund development plan. This is information that you should receive when you're first being oriented to your role as a new board member. For most boards, the expectation that I will also make a personal financial contribution that is meaningful to me. Another role, to provide names of potential supporters and donors to staff. Related to that, to visit funders and donors with the staff to tell the story of the organization. If we have special events, to attend those special events, those fundraising events. And in general, to act as a resource with respect to fund development to the executive director, or if we have one, to our director of fundraising or fund development. Another way to think about the individual and collective responsibilities of board members is to consider the three legal standards that apply to nonprofit board members. Let's spend a little time with each of these. The three standards: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience. Again, we'll take a look at each one. First, the duty of care, sometimes referred to as the prudent person test. Board directors must exercise ordinary and reasonable care in the performance of their duties. So the prudent person test, in legal terms, what would an ordinarily prudent person do in similar circumstances? So some of the responsibilities: regular attendance at board meetings would be an example of duty of care, active participation and discussion in decision-making within the board, good business judgment when it's called for, and a sense of financial integrity, individually and collectively. The duty of loyalty: board directors must act in a manner that does not cause harm to the organization, and board members cannot put personal interests above the interests of the organization. And for the last several years, there has been greater emphasis on the importance of boards having a formal conflict of interest policy in place. You need to become familiar with the conflict of interest policy within your organization. It should be in that board manual that we spoke of earlier in the program. And if there isn't a conflict of interest policy, this is your opportunity to exercise some leadership. You need to insist that the board move in order to have a formal conflict of interest policy in place. And then thirdly, the duty of obedience: board directors must act in accordance with the organization's governing documents, the mission, the articles of incorporation, our bylaws, and applicable laws and regulations that govern nonprofits in our state. I mean, one of the key questions here is, are we acting and deciding in alignment with our mission or fundamental purpose? And for all three of these legal duties, there's additional detail in the resource manual and specific actions associated with each legal duty. So I think that this will probably answer some of the questions that you may have about your legal responsibilities. Let's move on. Let's get a lay of the land. Let's start with the board organizational chart. It'll just, in a sense, give us a picture of the world or the environment within which the board operates. Let's take a look, to start with, let's take a look at the following chart that depicts the board and its relationships to standing committees and its executive director. Let's remember, first of all, that one size doesn't fit all, and this governance organizational chart is meant to convey a general picture that doesn't apply perfectly to every nonprofit, but it does illustrate some of the general principles. First, up at the top, the board of directors. Off to the right, an executive committee, typically the president, the vice president, the secretary, and the treasurer of the board. The executive committee has limited authority and is accountable, like all committees, to the board of directors. And then over to the right, we see our executive director, our chief staff person. Below the executive committee and the executive director, you can see 4 standing committees. Sometimes the bylaws will describe them by name, and sometimes the bylaws will simply describe the authority of the board to create the committees when the need arises. And standing committees, by definition, are ongoing, as distinct from special committees or task force that may be created by the board for special purposes from time to time. The executive director, I wanted to mention again that this individual is the chief professional staff officer hired by the board and directly accountable to the board, and that would be the board as a whole, not each individual board member. We'll talk a little bit more about the relationship between the board and the executive director in just a bit. Now let's take a look at the professional staffing structure. In the previous slide, we ended with the executive director, and this slide takes off from there. Again, the executive director is hired by the board of directors and is accountable to the board. The executive director is delegated the authority to hire additional staff. The executive director supervises these additional staff people who are accountable to the executive director. Now, ultimately, they're accountable to the board, but this accountability is through the executive director, so that the board does not supervise and direct the work of the other staff besides the executive director. In the sample staffing structure, you can see 4 managers below. These managers, in turn, might be responsible for additional staff. Now, up to this point, we've been talking about the governance roles and responsibilities of the board. We'd like to talk for a minute about some of the supporting roles that board members may play, and these are complementary to the governance roles. Take a look at the left column, which is meant to summarize the governing roles of the board carried out collectively. These are the things that we've talked about up to this point: setting the direction of the organization, determining which values and logic will guide the board and the organization, ensuring that the organization's resources are used prudently to advance its work. Now, in the right column, the support column, would be some of the other typical support roles that are played by the board. In carrying out these roles, board members typically are acting as individuals. Robert Andrina, author of the Board Member Answer book and many other important publications, is helpful in keeping the distinctions clear between the governance responsibilities and the other support responsibilities of the Board of Directors. Andrina has introduced the notion of the multiple hats that board members wear. And he talks about 3 hats. The governance hat, and you can see all of them summarized here. The governance hat, worn only when the full board meets, proper notice has been given according to the bylaws, and if there is a quorum requirement, we have met the quorum requirement. So the board is governing. The board is acting collectively to govern the organization. The second hat that board members wear, referred to as the implementation hat, worn only when the board gives one or more board members the authority to implement a board decision. So I'm acting as an individual on behalf of the board, and I have that authority only because the board has given me that authority. And then the third hat, the volunteer hat, worn at other times when board members are involved with organizational activities as volunteers. An example might be, let's say for instance that we're a youth serving organization, and in our program service portfolio, we have an after-school tutoring program. And as a board member, I think that this program is really important, and I decide to volunteer as an after-school tutor. When I'm volunteering as a tutor in the after-school program, I'm wearing my volunteer hat. I'm not in a governance mode as that individual volunteer. And it's very likely that I'm being directed by a staff person or maybe even another volunteer. And I think what's important is to know which hat we have on at any given time. And there's a little bit more detail about the 3 board member hats in the resource manual. Again, I encourage you to take a look. This is a really helpful framework. Now we're going to talk about the board at work. As a board member, you'll be engaged some important areas of work, and let's examine each one of them. We're going to look at the role of the board in strategic planning, policy making, board staff relations, meetings, committees and work groups, and we'll end with a look at how the board makes decisions, and this will really be a way of tying together some of these other activities. So, strategic planning. Let's start with a definition. Strategic planning is the process by which the guiding members of an organization envision its future and develop the necessary plans, procedures, and operations to achieve that future. And I would say this, that the board's involvement in strategic planning and strategic thinking is at the very heart of governance. When we talk about the role of the board as steering the ship, setting the direction, this is what we're able to figure out when we're in the strategic thinking and planning mode. And of course, this particular role would be in line with the strategic mode of governance that we spoke of earlier. Some of the strategic planning roles of the board, first of all, to participate actively in the strategic planning process. And so we're not bystanders. We're not waiting for the staff to develop a strategic plan and then deliver it to us after the work has been done. We need to be actively involved. We're also responsible for the formal approval decision with respect to the strategic plan. So when it is time to decide that this shall be our strategic plan, this shall be the official blueprint, strategic blueprint of the organization, that is a board decision. Assuring alignment of overall board and committee planning so that once we have the strategic plan in place, to make sure that that informs and inspires other forms of planning within the organization. It's also our responsibility to make sure that the strategic plan to some degree guides our board recruitment and development efforts. We're responsible for establishing outcomes for the strategic plan and then to monitor our success, our progress in achieving those outcomes, especially with respect to our programs and services, and then periodically to evaluate and update our strategic plan. And I think an important point here, boards define their roles with respect to strategic planning differently. Some boards stay at the level of mission, vision, and strategic priorities. Some boards go a little deeper into the action planning. I think it's an important question for you to ask and get an answer to. In your nonprofit, what precisely is the role of the board? And it's important to be clear about the approach taken in your nonprofit. One thing for sure, the board must play a leadership role in any case. Next, let's take a look at the board's role in policy making. Let's start with a definition. Policies are broad precepts or principles designed to influence, guide, and control future decisions of the board, directions, and actions that the board takes in the future. So policies are a particular kind of board decision making. And in general, the board needs to focus on broad organizational policies and leave some of the more detailed operating policies and procedures to the executive director or our CEO. One of the benefits of policies is that the board doesn't have to start from scratch when a certain policy, or pardon me, when a certain issue comes up again. It can use past experience as a guide. And then new experience can also lead to future revisions and refinements of policy. The types of policies, board policies address a number of important issues, and you can get a sense of the range of issues in the list on the slide before you right now. Earlier, we talked about the conflict of interest policy. Existing policies should be in the board manual that we spoke of earlier, and you need to be familiar with them if you're going to be an effective board member. So let's talk about, just real briefly, how policies take shape, how they take form, what the process is. The board first identifies a need for a new policy, and sometimes it's our executive director that calls attention to this. The next step is to assign a team to draft the new policy. That team can consist of board members or a combination of board and staff. In some instances, it might be just our staff. That team that we've identified is responsible for writing a first policy draft. Depending on the policy, it might be important to ask legal counsel to review the draft before taking action. Eventually, we present the draft policy to the board for a decision. And then in the future, we continue to review and revise this new policy and then other existing policies on an as-needed basis. The next area of board work, especially important, is the area of board-staff relations, building an effective relationship, an effective partnership between the board of directors and the staff, specifically the executive director. And it's critically important for the board to build an effective working relationship with the executive director. While board and staff have distinct roles and responsibilities, they really complement each other. And so we're talking about building a partnership. That's a word, that's a concept, a notion that we'll continue to come back to. The board and staff sometimes come at this partnership from a different vantage point, especially when there are any tensions in the relationship. The executive director, for the most part, wants the trust and confidence of the board, the room to do the job. So we might hear the executive director saying, "Don't micromanage me, don't focus on the details of my work." The board, for its part, wants to be involved in key decisions and have the assurance that things are on track. And so we'll hear the board, in so many words, saying, "Don't bypass us, keep us in the loop, keep us fully informed." But in general, the board is governing, the staff is implementing, responsible for administration, for carrying out the ends decision making that we talked about earlier. Here's some general guidance for building an effective working relationship between the board and the staff. First of all, ensure that there are current job descriptions in place for both the executive director and board members. Having it in writing isn't going to automatically prevent problems from arising from time to time, but without something in writing, I mean, we're really asking for it. It's more likely that there will be confusion about who's responsible for what. Secondly, maintain a healthy and mutually supportive relationship between the board chair and the executive director. These two leaders are really important in the organization, in the nonprofit, and the relationship between the two of them needs to be really solid and well-functioning. Next, maintain clarity regarding the board's policy and oversight functions. We've talked about this a little bit earlier. And in general, make sure that there is good information flow between the board and the staff. We want to keep each other informed, no surprises if at all possible. And then we also talked earlier about the importance of periodic assessment of the board and of the executive director. Use these assessment activities, these assessment processes as opportunities to deepen, to strengthen the relationship between the board and the staff, and in general, to enhance the performance of both. Another useful tool in constructing an effective working relationship between the board and the executive director is the use of a responsibility matrix. In the resource manual, you'll find an excellent example of this tool. We encourage you to take a look. Here's an excerpt on the screen, the three-column format. In the first column, a general area of board or organizational activity, in the example, finance and accounting. In the second column, a capsule description of the board's responsibility with respect to finance. And then in the third column, over on the right, the responsibilities of the executive director summarized. And the advantage here in this multi-column format is that in the same glance, in the same view, we can see the distinct responsibilities of the board of directors and the executive director. But because the columns are side by side, we can also get a sense of how the two roles intersect, how they complement each other. And again, we encourage you to take a look at the full example in the resource manual. We also encourage organizations to take the tool, the responsibility matrix, as a starting point and then edit as needed. Again, one size doesn't fit all. Start with the version in the resource manual and then make it your own. The next important area are board meetings. And this is really where the board, for the most part, gets to be the board, the governing body. This is really where it happens. If the board is effective in carrying out its responsibilities, it's due in large part because the meetings are well planned, well attended, and they focus on governance decision making. I'd like to start by contrasting the traditional approach to board meetings with the new emerging approach. And in the traditional approach, summarized by some of the subpoints there, board meetings are primarily emphasizing the transmission of information and reports. So the executive director, other staff, our committees are presenting lots of great information, but we're sitting and listening to these reports. The problem is that if this is what fills our meeting time, we never have an opportunity to do some of that strategic and generative work that we talked about earlier. In the traditional approach, we're using the same agenda structure month after month and year after year. And in general, we're focusing on the past and the present, which is important. But remember, that's not all that a board is called to do. Now, in the new approach, the emphasis is more on active participation and decision-making on the part of the board. And as we described strategic and generative work a little bit earlier, we're using some of our meeting time for that kind of activity. We'll talk in a moment about consent agendas, a powerful tool for limiting the amount of time devoted to reports and information so that we can free up more time for the strategic and generative work. In this new approach, meetings are outcome driven. In other words, whoever is responsible for putting the agenda of board meetings together, typically the executive director and the board chair, they start by asking themselves, what are the most important outcomes? What are the 2 or 3 or 4 most important outcomes that we want from the upcoming board meeting? And then, in a sense, to work backwards from that. If these are the outcomes, how do we structure our board meeting time so that we're sure to achieve those important outcomes? And this may lead us to design meetings that are different from the typical routine agenda structure that we've been used to in the past. And in general, in this new approach, the meetings, while we spend some time focusing on the fiduciary work, what's happened since the last board meeting, what's going on right now, that increasingly we focus more of our time on the future, on what's coming next. I want to talk a little more about the consent agenda. Another important tool is using a consent agenda, and the main features are summarized here on the slide. In the use of a consent agenda, we bundle routine items together, and we act on them with one vote. And this eliminates the need to vote separately on a number of routine items. When we handle them one at a time, that frequently leads to unnecessary discussion, and it really wastes some of our precious time. So the intent here is to expedite, to speed up some of the routine business at a board meeting so that we have more time to address critical issues, some of that strategic and generative work that we've been talking about. And in actual practice, the safeguard so that if there are any concerns about not spending adequate time on important matters, typically, when we use a consent agenda, any individual board member can ask to have an item taken off the consent agenda, and then the item can be discussed more fully. In your resource packet, there is a further description of the use of the consent agenda with links to 2 excellent online resources for using this powerful tool effectively. There's also a sample board meeting agenda that includes a consent agenda component in the resource manual. Again, we encourage you to take a look at this additional material. Before we leave the consent agenda, on this slide we can see some examples of items that might go on a consent agenda. Committee and previous board meeting minutes, minor changes in a procedure, a routine revision of a policy, updating documents, a standard contract that is regularly used by the board, and then confirmation of conventional actions that are required in the bylaws. And I think, again, the point to be made here is that we receive this information in advance of the board meeting, so we have ample time to review, to familiarize ourselves with the material, with these items, before we act on them at the upcoming board meeting. As important as board meetings are in terms of doing the work of the board, board committees and work groups are also really key. The board does a lot of work in its board meetings, that's for sure, but much of the board's work is also done in its committees. So committees need to function well, and board members need to be active in the committee work. This is a chart that we looked at a little earlier. And so again, we see the executive committee and some of the standing committees of the organization. And of course, this is just an example. Again, one size doesn't fit all. Here's some guidance regarding what it takes to have effective board committees. Let's take a look. First of all, committee participation is stressed from the very beginning as an expectation for all board members. So in the written job description that is used when we're first recruiting board members, we talk about our expectation that each individual board member will be involved in committee work. We're talking primarily now about committees of the board. So the purpose of these committee structures is to help the board do its governance work. The committee structure needs to be aligned with the strategic plan. So periodically, based on our strategic thinking and planning, we might decide to alter the committee structure so that it really fits with the strategic priorities moving forward. And especially in the last several years, the focus has been on reducing the number of standing committees, so a small number of standing committees, a lean structure, if you will, and to begin to rely on temporary structures, task forces, and work groups that are responsible for work on behalf of the board. And once that work is completed, the committee, the work group, the task force ceases to exist. It's also important to have a capable chair, someone that is good at leading a group into action, someone that is good at encouraging decision-making in a timely manner, someone who is good at mediating the conflicts that are always going to arise from time to time. And in the resource, you'll find, at the resource manual, you'll find a number of sample committee descriptions, also a sample committee chair job description, and a sample board and committee meeting calendar. So some additional information that will help you think about the place of committees and work groups in the board structure. This last element in the list, matching member interests and assets with committee needs, I'd like to talk a little bit more about this matching between individual board members and the committee responsibilities. And so I refer to this as the board member committee match. And so the board member, we're seeking to create conditions for the board member to really make a close connection between themselves, what's important to them as an individual, and the work of a committee. And so to illustrate that, just imagine that we're able to make connections between the board members' needs and interests, their personal and professional goals, their skills, the experience that they have, and also the experience that they hope to acquire. And then in general, the personal growth goals that they have for themselves. And so the idea here is that when possible, to really encourage individual board members to select a committee that is a good fit for them. We're getting what we need as an organization, and the board member is also getting what they need. And it's really in our interest as an organization for this matching to happen. The more connections, the better. We would also encourage you to use this concept, this board member committee match, to make your own decisions about the committee or work group you will work with as a member of your board. And now we'd like to try to bring some of the pieces together by looking at the board decision-making flow. Let's wrap things up by examining a board decision flow chart. Previously, we talked about board meetings. We talked about committee structure. We've made reference to the executive committee and a number of other things. It all comes together in the way the board approaches decision-making. So let's take a look. So over on the left, starting with stage one, issues and topics come to our attention. Some of these may need board deliberation. And this list is compiled on an ongoing basis by the board president and the executive director. And they come from multiple sources. They can come from other board members. They can come from the staff. They can come from outside stakeholders. They're just a variety of sources for the issues and topics that, in a sense, come to the board's attention. Stage two, all of these issues and topics are brought to the executive committee that meets periodically with the executive director to prepare the agenda for the board meeting. And think of the executive committee as acting as clearinghouse. So we have all of these issues and topics. Some of them need to go to the board. Others don't need to go to the board. They need to be addressed, but not necessarily by the board as a whole. In some cases, they can be delegated to staff. They can be delegated to committees. They can be delegated to outside stakeholders in some instances, but not everything needs to go to the board. Stage three, based on the previous deliberations of the executive committee and the executive director in developing the agenda, the board meets. During this meeting, the board may take action on some of the issues, or it may delegate some of these questions, some of these topics and issues to its committees for additional research, development of action recommendations, or in some cases, to take action right on the spot. In the fourth stage, the committees do any work that the board has asked them to do, so that delegation of work to the committees, this is where the committees do that work. And then stage five, the executive committee meets again with the executive director to plan the agenda for the next board meeting. And the executive committee in stage five, as we're describing it, also has the benefit of the work that committees will have done since the previous board meeting. So that is factored into the agenda setting. And then step 6, the committee's report. The board takes action as appropriate. In some instances, the board might decide we're still not ready to make a decision, so we'll delegate some additional study to a particular committee or work group, but eventually decisions get made by the board. And this process repeats itself. You'll find a more detailed description of this board decision-making flowchart in the resource manual. And again, we encourage you to take a look. We'd like to draw to a close by calling your attention to some of the resources that are included in the bibliography that is part of the resource manual. There are a number of important resources that you can draw upon. BoardSource, the preeminent resource for governance in the United States. The second bullet point, BoardSource as part of membership in the organization provides full access to its excellent website, lots and lots of great resources. In addition, you also get a board member newsletter published 6 times a year. Also from BoardSource, one publication in particular, Getting on Board with Effective Orientation, really excellent. The next bullet point, board development resources from the Center for Public Skills Training, our organization. And you can see the resource link, a number of resources that are available, downloadable at no charge. And then we talked earlier about the critical role of the board in partnership and collaboration planning. And so another important item included in the resource bibliography is the Board Members Guide to Partnership Planning from the AIM Alliance. So we'd really encourage you to take a look at the entire bibliography with special attention to the resources that we've highlighted. And so we end with the conviction, the encouragement that boards, when they're organized well, when board members individually and collectively understand what their roles and responsibilities are, really add value to the work of nonprofits in our communities, in our country. In fact, it's really almost impossible to imagine that a nonprofit would be effective, would be successful in delivering on its mission without an effective board of directors. It's really, really critical. So we'll end with some contact information. Feel free to contact us if you have additional questions about any of the material that we've covered. We're happy to respond to questions by email, and in some cases, if it will help, we'll provide additional resources. So we wish you the very, very best, and thanks so much for your willingness to serve as leaders on your board of directors.